Some people see what no one else sees, and it's not because they are smarter, more intuitive, or more experienced. It happens in moments so ordinary that they're easy to miss. A room fills with tension, but no one can explain why. Conversations continue, smiles appear. Then someone pauses, looks around and says, "Something here is off." Minutes later, the truth surfaces, and everyone wonders how they missed it. Nothing new appeared in that moment. No secret was revealed. What changed was perception. While others were caught in the obvious, one person was aware of what was unfolding beneath it. This difference is not talent. It is a way of observing that can be learned, trained, and lived. You don't see the world with your eyes as much as you think you do. Your eyes receive light, shapes, movement, but what you actually experience is filtered, organized, and given meaning by your state of consciousness. Two people can stand in the same place, look at the same scene, hear the same words, and walk away with completely different understandings of what just happened. The difference was never visual acuity, it was awareness. Most of your life, you were trained to believe that seeing is passive. You open your eyes, the world enters, and that's it. But perception is an active process. Your expectations, fears, memories, and emotional habits are constantly editing reality before it reaches you. This is why you often don't notice what later seems obvious. It was always there, but your consciousness wasn't tuned to receive it. Think about how often you react before you actually see. Someone speaks, and before the sentence ends, your mind is already preparing a defense, a judgment, or a story. In that moment, your eyes may still be open, but perception has closed. You are no longer observing what is happening. You are replaying what you already believe. This is why reaction is a form of blindness. It collapses the present moment into the past. Conscious observation works differently. It does not rush to label. It does not immediately decide what something means. It creates a small internal distance between what is happening and the impulse to respond. In that space, something subtle becomes visible. Tone beneath words, intention beneath behavior, patterns beneath chaos. This is not mystical. It is neurological and experiential. When the nervous system is not flooded by automatic reaction, perception becomes more precise. You've experienced this before, even if you didn't name it. Moments when you suddenly realized what someone was really feeling, not because they told you, but because something in their posture, timing, or silence revealed it. Moments when you sensed that a situation was off, even though everything looked fine on the surface. Those perceptions didn't come from thinking harder. They came from being quieter inside. The world constantly trains you in the opposite direction. Speed is rewarded. Immediate opinions are praised. Silence is uncomfortable. The faster you react, the more engaged you seem. But engagement is not awareness. Noise fills attention, and attention filled with noise cannot see depth. When consciousness is cluttered, perception becomes flat. Everything looks obvious, predictable, and repetitive, not because it is, but because you are only seeing the surface. This is where many people misunderstand awakening. They assume it has something to do with acquiring new ideas, beliefs, or spiritual language. But perception does not improve by adding more concepts. In fact, too many concepts often reduce clarity. Conscious seeing happens when the mind stops interfering long enough for reality to reveal itself without commentary. Silence is not emptiness, it is resolution. When you begin to notice how much of your seeing is actually interpretation, something shifts. You realize that you rarely encounter the world directly. You encounter your thoughts about it. Your opinions about people, about yourself, about what is possible or dangerous, form a lens so familiar that you forget it's there. Consciousness, when trained, becomes the ability to notice the lens itself. This is uncomfortable at first. It requires you to admit that many of your certainties are habits, not truths, that what you always see may simply be what you've always expected. But this discomfort is productive. It creates humility in perception, and humility sharpens awareness. As this shift begins, you stop relying solely on what is obvious. You start sensing what is implied, what is forming, what has not yet fully appeared. You notice pauses in conversation, inconsistencies in behavior, emotional undercurrents that don't match the words being spoken. You also begin to see yourself more clearly. The moment irritation arises, the instant pride tightens the chest, the subtle fear that precedes control. This kind of seeing doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. Action that comes after observation is different from reaction. It carries less noise, less regret. It is aligned with what is actually happening, not with what you assumed was happening. That alignment is felt by others, even if they can't explain it. And here is the quiet threshold most people miss. The more you observe without immediately reacting, the more you become aware of how much stimulation is constantly pulling at your attention. Sounds, screens, notifications, inner commentary, emotional residue from past interactions, all of it competes to define what you see next. Until this is noticed, perception remains fragmented. This naturally leads to the next realization. It is not that reality is hidden, but that attention is continuously hijacked. And until that hijacking is seen clearly, consciousness remains occupied with noise instead of truth. Reaction feels natural. It feels fast, alive, even intelligent. Something happens, and your system responds instantly, as if speed itself were proof of awareness. But reaction is not perception. Reaction is the mind protecting what it already believes. The moment you react, your consciousness narrows, and whatever does not fit your internal narrative disappears from view. This is why reaction blinds. When you react, you are not meeting the present moment. You are meeting a memory. A tone of voice reminds you of a past conflict, so your body tightens before you understand why. A comment triggers defensiveness because it brushes against an old insecurity. The situation in front of you becomes secondary. What takes over is a pattern, well-rehearsed and emotionally charged. In that state, your eyes may still be open, but your awareness is closed around a single interpretation. Observation requires something counterintuitive in a culture of speed. Delay. Not hesitation born of fear, but a deliberate pause that allows perception to expand. In that pause, the nervous system settles just enough for additional information to register. You begin to notice details that reaction ignores: the pacing of the interaction, the emotional temperature of the room, your own internal signals. These details were always present, but reaction filtered them out. This is why people who constantly react feel that life is happening to them. They move from stimulus to stimulus, convinced they are making choices, while actually repeating automatic responses. Over time, this creates exhaustion. The same conflicts reappear, the same misunderstandings loop. From the inside, it feels like bad luck. From the perspective of observation, it is predictability. Consider how often certainty accompanies reaction. The faster the reaction, the more convinced you feel that you are right. But certainty is not accuracy. It is simply the emotional reward of a closed loop. Observation, on the other hand, tolerates uncertainty. It allows multiple possibilities to exist at once. This tolerance keeps perception open long enough for reality to show its complexity. There is a subtle physical difference between reacting and observing. Reaction contracts the body. Breath becomes shallow. Muscles prepare for defense or attack, even in harmless situations. Observation softens. Breathing deepens slightly. The face relaxes. This physiological shift is not incidental. It determines what you can perceive. A contracted system is designed for survival, not insight. An open system can register nuance. Many people believe that if they stop reacting, they will lose control or appear weak. The opposite is true. Reaction hands control to the trigger. Whatever provokes you decides your behavior. Observation reclaims authorship. By seeing before acting, you choose your response instead of being driven by it. This choice is where real strength resides. You can see this clearly in conflicts. When someone reacts immediately, the interaction escalates. Each reaction feeds the next. Very little is actually heard. But when one person observes instead, listens to the words, the emotion underneath, and their own internal impulses without immediately acting on them, the dynamic changes. The conversation slows, new options appear, not because of strategy, but because perception widened. Observation also reveals something uncomfortable: how much of your reactivity is self-protective. Many reactions are attempts to avoid feeling something: shame, fear, vulnerability, uncertainty. By reacting, you escape the sensation, but you also lose information. Observation asks you to stay present with the sensation just long enough to see what it's actually about. Often, what you feared was smaller and more manageable than the reaction suggested. This is where clarity begins to replace compulsion. You start noticing the exact moment when reaction is about to take over. There is a flicker, a tightening, a rush, an urge to speak or act. That moment is usually missed, but when it is seen, a new space opens. You realize that reaction is not inevitable, it is optional. As this practice deepens, you begin to see patterns not only in yourself, but in others. You recognize when someone is speaking from habit rather than presence. You sense when defensiveness is masking insecurity, when aggression is covering fear. This does not make you superior. It makes you less entangled. You are no longer pulled into every emotional current that passes through the room. And yet, this level of observation introduces a new challenge. When you stop reacting outwardly, your attention naturally turns inward. You begin to notice what you usually avoid seeing in yourself: the recurring emotional triggers, the stories you protect, the identities you defend. This inner observation is where resistance often arises, because it removes the distraction of blaming the outside world. This is the threshold where many people unconsciously return to reaction. It feels easier to react to others than to observe oneself. But once this pattern is noticed, something else becomes visible. The outer world has been mirroring what you haven't wanted to look at internally, and that realization quietly sets the stage for what comes next. Most people are not distracted in the way they imagine. It is not just that their attention wanders from one thing to another. It is that their consciousness has been conditioned to live inside a constant stream of noise, and over time, that noise becomes invisible. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel normal. Silence begins to feel strange, even threatening. This is how hypnosis works, not through force, but through repetition. Noise today is not only sound. It is information without digestion, opinions without reflection, stimulation without meaning. The mind jumps from headline to message to memory to worry, rarely staying long enough to truly perceive what is happening. This creates the illusion of awareness. You feel informed, connected, engaged, but beneath that surface activity, perception is fragmented. You are everywhere except where you are. Hypnosis does not require a trance, it requires rhythm, predictable patterns that keep attention moving without depth. Notifications arrive, emotions spike, the mind reacts, then it resets, waiting for the next stimulus. Over time, this rhythm trains the nervous system to crave interruption. Stillness becomes uncomfortable because it reveals how restless the mind has become. This is why many people say they want clarity, but avoid the conditions that make clarity possible. When the noise briefly stops, unresolved thoughts and emotions surface. Old doubts, unfelt grief, unexamined fear. Noise acts as a cover, a way to keep these things at bay. But the cost of this avoidance is perception. When attention is constantly occupied, it cannot sense subtlety. You can see this in everyday interactions. People half listen while already preparing their response. They miss shifts in tone, pauses that signal hesitation, or moments when something meaningful is about to be said. The conversation moves on, but something essential was never noticed. This happens not because people don't care, but because their attention has been trained to skim rather than settle. The same pattern appears internally. Thoughts interrupt thoughts. Emotions are quickly labeled and pushed aside. There is little space to feel something fully before the next distraction arrives. Over time, this creates a shallow relationship with experience. Life feels busy, but oddly thin. Events happen, yet they don't register deeply enough to transform understanding. What makes this hypnosis powerful is that it feels voluntary. You choose to scroll, you choose to stay busy, you choose to fill every quiet moment. But conditioning shapes choice. When silence triggers discomfort, noise feels like relief. The relief is temporary, but the habit strengthens. Gradually, the capacity for sustained observation weakens. This is not a moral failing, it is a physiological one. The brain adapts to what it is fed. Constant stimulation trains it to seek novelty over depth. speed over comprehension, certainty over inquiry. In this state, perception becomes reactive rather than receptive. You don't notice what is emerging, you only respond to what is loud enough to break through. The irony is that the most important information is rarely loud. Subtle changes in mood, early signs of misalignment, quiet intuitions that something is off. These signals require a level of internal quiet to be perceived. When the mind is saturated with noise, these signals are drowned out. Later, when the consequences become obvious, people say it came out of nowhere. It didn't. It was just never heard. As awareness sharpens, you begin to notice how often you reach for noise automatically. Not because you need it, but because you're avoiding something else, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps boredom, perhaps a feeling you don't have a name for yet. This noticing is not about self-judgment. It is about seeing the mechanism at work. Once seen, the spell weakens. You realize that noise is not the enemy, but unconscious consumption is. There is a difference between engaging with information and being pulled by it, between choosing stimulation and being unable to tolerate its absence. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything about perception. As the grip of noise loosens, even slightly, gaps begin to appear. Small moments where attention is no longer immediately occupied. In these gaps, something unfamiliar emerges, a clearer sense of what you are actually experiencing rather than what you are being told to experience. Thoughts slow, sensations become more vivid. The world feels less rushed, not because it changed, but because your relationship to it did. And in those quieter moments, another realization begins to form. It becomes apparent that much of what you call being awake has been built on accumulation. More knowledge, more input, more explanations. But the deeper kind of awareness does not come from adding. It comes from subtracting, from letting perception operate without constant interference. This realization gently opens the door to a subtle but common misunderstanding that almost everyone makes when they begin to question their own consciousness. When people begin to sense that something about their perception is limited, they often turn toward what they believe will expand it. They read more, watch more, learn new frameworks, adopt new language. On the surface, this looks like awakening. There is curiosity, motivation, even moments of insight. But beneath it, a subtle mistake often forms, one that quietly replaces one form of unconsciousness with another. The mistake is assuming that awakening is an accumulation process, that if you gather enough concepts, symbols, or explanations, clarity will eventually appear. The mind loves this approach because it feels productive. You can measure progress, you can compare yourself to others, you can feel ahead. But perception does not deepen through accumulation, it deepens through refinement. Knowledge operates in the realm of thought. Awakening operates in the realm of attention. Confusing the two leads to a strange contradiction. People who can speak eloquently about awareness, presence, and consciousness, yet rarely experience them directly. The language becomes a substitute for perception. Instead of seeing more clearly, the mind becomes better at describing what clarity should look like. This is where many become trapped without realizing it. They identify with the role of the awakened one, or at least the one who is trying. That identity subtly demands consistency. Certain reactions are no longer allowed. Certain doubts feel threatening. Instead of observing what arises, the person begins managing how they appear to themselves. Awareness turns performative. Another version of the same mistake appears when people try to force silence. They attempt to suppress thoughts, control emotions, or escape discomfort in the name of being conscious. But suppression is not observation. Control is not clarity. When you fight the mind, you remain entangled with it. The effort itself becomes another layer of noise. True awakening does not require the elimination of thought. It requires a change in relationship to thought. Thoughts can arise without being believed. Emotions can move without being obeyed. This distinction is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic experiences. But subtlety is where perception lives. There is also the mistake of chasing extraordinary states. Visions, bliss, altered experiences become benchmarks of progress. When they appear, people feel successful. When they fade, frustration follows. But extraordinary states are temporary by nature. They come and go. If awakening depends on them, it becomes fragile. The ordinary moment, when nothing special is happening, is where awareness is either present or it isn't. Perhaps the most overlooked mistake is turning awakening into self-improvement, the idea that you are becoming a better, more evolved version of yourself. This keeps the focus on the self as an object to be fixed or enhanced. Observation, however, reveals that the sense of self is itself something that appears in awareness. When awakening is framed as improvement, the observer and the observed collapse back into one, and clarity dissolves. What all these mistakes have in common is subtle identification. Identification with knowledge, with silence, with experiences, with an image of being conscious. Each identification narrows perception in a different way. It gives the mind something to hold on to, which feels safe, but limits what can be seen. When this is noticed, a shift becomes possible. Awakening begins to look less like achieving something and more like removing interference, less like reaching a destination and more like stopping unnecessary movement. Attention settles not because it is forced, but because there is nothing left pulling it away in that moment. This does not feel dramatic. In fact, it can feel almost disappointing at first. There is no announcement, no clear milestone, just a quieter, more honest relationship with experience. You start to see how often you were trying to get somewhere else instead of noticing where you already were. And with that honesty comes a new challenge. If awakening is not about becoming something, then it must involve seeing what is already happening without filters. This includes parts of yourself that are uncomfortable, contradictory, or unresolved. At this stage, many people unconsciously turn away again, not toward noise this time, but toward ideals. Yet awareness does not ask you to become ideal. It asks you to observe identification itself, to notice the moment you believe you are your thoughts, your emotions, your roles, your achievements. That noticing quietly prepares the ground for the next shift, where the question is no longer how to awaken, but who is doing the awakening in the first place. The cycle of identification is so familiar that it rarely feels like a cycle at all. It feels like reality. A thought arises and instantly becomes me. An emotion moves through the body and turns into how I am. A role is assumed and slowly hardens into identity. None of this is questioned because it happens automatically, beneath conscious attention. Identification does not announce itself. It blends in. From early on, you learn to answer the question, who are you, with labels. A name, a profession, a personality, a history. These references are useful, but over time they become more than references. They become boundaries. You begin to protect them, defend them, and react on their behalf. The moment something threatens an identity, the nervous system responds as if survival itself were at risk. This is why identification is not just psychological. It is physiological. When a belief about yourself is challenged, the body reacts before the mind has time to reflect. Heart rate changes, muscles tighten, thoughts accelerate. In that state, observation is nearly impossible. You are inside the identity, not seeing it, and the cycle continues. Identification feeds on repetition. The more often a thought is believed, the more familiar it feels. Familiarity is mistaken for truth. I am this kind of person. This always happens to me. I can't change that. Each statement reinforces a lens through which future experiences are interpreted. Events that confirm the identity are noticed. Those that contradict it are minimized or ignored. Emotions play a powerful role here. An emotional reaction often becomes proof of identity. Feeling angry confirms the story of being wronged. Feeling anxious confirms the story of being unsafe. Feeling proud confirms the story of being superior. The emotion feels personal, intimate, undeniable. But observation reveals that emotions arise, peak, and dissolve on their own when not continuously fed by interpretation. Achievements and failures also become objects of identification. Success inflates the self-image. Failure diminishes it. Both bind awareness to outcome. When identity depends on performance, life becomes a constant negotiation between validation and fear. Perception narrows to whatever protects the image. Curiosity fades. Openness feels risky. What makes this cycle difficult to break is that identification provides a sense of stability. Even painful identities feel safer than uncertainty. At least you know who you are, even if you don't like it. Observation, by contrast, dissolves certainty. It shows that thoughts, emotions, and roles are transient. For the mind, this can feel like groundlessness. But this groundlessness is not emptiness. It is space. Space in which perception is no longer confined to a single storyline. When identification loosens, you begin to see thoughts as events, not facts, emotions as movements, not commands, roles as functions, not definitions. This shift does not remove these experiences. It contextualizes them. You can notice the beginning of this shift in small moments. A thought arises, and instead of immediately believing it, you recognize it as a thought. An emotion appears, and instead of acting it out or suppressing it, you allow it to be felt. A role is activated, but you sense that it is something you are doing, not something you are. These moments are brief at first, but they are transformative. The cycle of identification weakens not through effort, but through recognition. The more often you see identification happening, the less convincing it becomes. It loses its invisibility. What once felt like "I am" begins to feel like "this is happening." That shift alone creates a different quality of freedom. As identification loosens, a new kind of observation becomes possible. You start noticing the exact moment you attach to a thought or emotion. The split second where awareness contracts and self-image takes over. That moment is subtle, but it is decisive. Seeing it does not require judgment. It requires honesty. This honesty, however, brings you face to face with something deeper. When you are no longer fully identified with thoughts, emotions, or roles, a question naturally arises. If you are not these things, what are you? The mind will try to answer with another concept, another identity, but observation reveals that what is aware of identification cannot itself be an object. This realization is not an endpoint. It is a doorway, because once you begin to sense yourself as the observer, rather than the content of experience, attention naturally moves to the space just before identification forms. To the instant before a thought is claimed, before an emotion becomes mine. And in that micro-moment, something previously invisible begins to reveal itself. There is a moment so brief that it is usually missed, yet it determines almost everything that follows. It exists between what happens and what you do about it. A word is spoken, a thought appears, a sensation rises in the body. Before reaction takes over, there is a narrow opening. That opening is the gateway. Most people live as if this moment does not exist. Life feels like a continuous chain of causes and effects, one reaction triggering the next. But when attention becomes refined through observation, this micro-interval begins to reveal itself. At first, it feels like a hesitation, a slight suspension of movement. Then it becomes recognizable, almost familiar, and with familiarity comes choice. In that moment before reaction, nothing is fixed yet. The meaning of what happened has not fully formed. The body has registered a signal, but it has not committed to an action. The mind has not completed its story. This is not passivity, it is potential. And potential is where perception is most accurate. Reaction collapses this moment instantly. It rushes to interpret, judge, defend, or attack. The gateway closes, and the old pattern resumes. Observation keeps it open just long enough for something new to be seen. Often, what is seen is not external at all, but internal. The urge to protect an image, the fear of being misunderstood, the habit of control. This is where many people misunderstand self-control. They believe control means overriding impulses, but overriding still operates after reaction has begun. The gateway exists before that. It is not about force, it is about timing. When you see the impulse as it forms, it does not need to be suppressed. Awareness itself alters its trajectory. Physiologically, this moment is subtle, a change in breath, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of thought. These are signals, not commands. When unnoticed, they lead directly to action. When observed, they become information. The body relaxes slightly, not because the situation changed, but because awareness entered the process. This is why true observation feels grounding. It reconnects you to the present before interpretation takes over. Instead of being pulled into memory or anticipation, attention stays with what is actually happening now. From that position, responses become more accurate, less reactive. Not because you are trying to be calm, but because clarity naturally reduces urgency. As this moment becomes more accessible, you begin to notice patterns. The same types of situations trigger the same internal sequences. The same words provoke the same tension. The same fears arise before the same behaviors. This repetition is not a flaw. It is a map. Each pattern points directly to where attention has habitually gone unconscious. The gateway moment also reveals something humbling. How rarely reaction is necessary. Many responses you once believed were essential turn out to be optional. Silence becomes a valid response. Listening becomes an action. Waiting becomes a form of intelligence. The world does not collapse when you don't immediately assert yourself. Often it reorganizes. This does not mean withdrawal from life. It means engagement from a deeper level. When you act after observation, your actions carry less friction. They are aligned with context rather than driven by compulsion. Others may not understand why your presence feels different, but they will feel it. There is less defensiveness, more coherence. However, as the space before reaction becomes clearer, attention naturally turns toward another layer of perception. You begin to notice not only your reactions, but the reactions of others. The way people move from stimulus to response without awareness. The emotional loops they are caught in. This can create a sense of separation if not understood correctly. The key is not to use observation as a position of superiority. The same gateway exists in everyone. The same mechanisms are at work. Seeing this fosters compassion rather than distance. It also raises an important question. If reactions are so patterned and predictable, what is it that notices them without being bound by them? This question does not need an immediate answer. In fact, answers tend to close inquiry too quickly. What matters is that attention begins to sense itself as something prior to reaction, something that can witness impulses without being consumed by them. And as this sensing stabilizes, perception expands beyond the personal. You start noticing patterns not just in moments, but across time, in yourself and in others, waiting to be recognized. When observation becomes stable, perception begins to organize itself in a new way. Events are no longer seen as isolated incidents. They start to connect. Behaviors repeat. Emotional tones echo across different situations. What once felt random reveals an underlying structure. This is not imagination. It is pattern recognition emerging from clarity rather than assumption. Most people miss patterns because they are absorbed in content. They focus on what is being said, what just happened, what went wrong this time. The observer notices how it happens, the sequence, the timing, the emotional rhythm. This shift changes everything. Instead of being surprised by outcomes, you begin to anticipate them, not by prediction, but by recognition. Hidden patterns are not hidden because they are rare. They are hidden because they are subtle and familiar. The same tension appears before the same conflict. The same hesitation shows up before the same missed opportunity. The same justification arises after the same behavior. These patterns are easy to overlook when attention is scattered, but impossible to ignore when awareness is steady. This applies equally to others and to yourself. You start noticing how certain people consistently respond from the same emotional position, regardless of context. One person always seeks control when uncertain. Another withdraws when challenged. Another performs confidence to avoid vulnerability. Once seen, these patterns explain far more than individual actions ever could. This is why seasoned observers often appear intuitive. They seem to know what will happen next, but what they are actually seeing is the momentum of pattern. Behavior follows grooves that have been reinforced over time. When nothing interrupts those grooves, the outcome is already implied in the beginning. In yourself, this recognition can be unsettling. You may realize how often you repeat emotional cycles you believed you had outgrown, how familiar reactions reappear in new situations wearing different masks. Observation does not judge this repetition, it reveals it. and revelation is the first interruption. Patterns are maintained by unobserved identification. When a thought or emotion is automatically believed, it reinforces the pattern it belongs to. When it is observed instead, the reinforcement weakens. Over time, patterns lose their grip not because you fight them, but because they are no longer fed unconsciously. Another dimension of pattern perception emerges in relationships. You begin to see how dynamics co-create themselves, how one person's reaction invites another's, how roles are silently assigned and accepted. Victim, rescuer, authority, rebel. These roles feel personal, but they are often structural. Once noticed, participation becomes optional. This does not make you detached, it makes you precise. You can choose whether to step into a familiar pattern or respond from presence. This choice often changes the entire dynamic, even if the other person remains the same. Patterns require mutual participation to continue. Awareness withdraws that participation. There is also a quieter level of pattern perception that unfolds internally. You start noticing how attention itself moves, what it is drawn to, what it avoids, where it tightens and where it relaxes. This reveals personal conditioning at a deeper level than thought content. You see not just what you think, but how you think. As this sensitivity grows, perception becomes less dramatic and more accurate. You stop attributing everything to intention or personality. You see context, conditioning, and timing. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it clarifies it. Clarity reduces unnecessary emotional charge, which in turn sharpens perception further. At a certain point, you may notice something unexpected. The same patterns you see in individuals appear at larger scales, in organizations, in families, in cultures. The way tension builds, how blame circulates, how avoidance masquerades as busyness, the observer recognizes these structures because they mirror the same mechanisms seen within. This recognition carries responsibility. Seeing patterns without reacting to them requires restraint. The temptation is to point them out, to correct others, to feel ahead. But observation matures into discretion. Not every pattern needs to be named. Some dissolve simply by not being reinforced. As awareness stabilizes at this level, another realization emerges quietly. The patterns you see outside often correspond to patterns you have avoided seeing inside. Certain dynamics appear repeatedly in your life, not because of coincidence, but because they resonate with something unresolved. This is not blame, it is information. When this is seen honestly, the direction of observation shifts again. Attention turns inward, not to analyze, but to notice what has been habitually overlooked, what has been pushed aside, what has been projected outward instead of felt directly. And this shift reveals a deeper principle at work, one that connects perception, avoidance, and experience in a way that cannot be ignored for long. There is a quiet principle at work in human perception that most people sense but rarely examine. What remains unseen within does not disappear. It looks for expression, and when it is not recognized internally, it often appears externally, wearing the face of circumstance, conflict, or other people. This is not metaphysical punishment. It is perceptual mechanics. Avoidance narrows awareness. When a feeling, impulse, or truth feels uncomfortable, attention instinctively turns away. The mind finds explanations. The environment provides distractions, but what is avoided does not dissolve. It stays active beneath the surface, influencing perception, behavior, and interpretation. Over time, it begins to shape what you notice in the world. This is why certain situations repeat with striking familiarity. The same type of conflict shows up in different relationships. The same frustrations emerge in new environments. On the surface, the variables change. Internally, something remains constant. Observation reveals that what you react strongly to outside often corresponds to something unobserved inside. Projection is not deliberate. It happens automatically. An unacknowledged fear is seen as threat in others. An unaccepted trait is noticed everywhere else. A denied desire becomes irritation at those who express it freely. The mind believes it is responding to the world as it is, unaware that it is highlighting what it refuses to see in itself. This mechanism explains why advice rarely works in these situations. You can change jobs, partners, locations, routines, yet the same emotional patterns resurface. The observer notices that the external trigger is not the origin. It is the mirror. And mirrors do not create images, they reflect them. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges the habit of external blame. Blame feels relieving. It places the cause outside, where it feels easier to manage. Observation reclaims that cause without accusation. It does not say you are wrong. It says there is information here that has not yet been integrated. Integration begins with allowing awareness to rest on what has been avoided. This does not require analysis or self-criticism. It requires presence. Feeling what has been bypassed, admitting what has been denied. Not to change it, but to see it clearly. What is fully seen loses its need for projection. As this process unfolds, perception of the outer world subtly changes. Situations that once triggered strong reactions begin to feel neutral, not because they disappeared, but because the internal charge has dissolved. Without the charge, the mirror no longer has the same image to reflect. This does not mean the world becomes pleasant or agreeable. It becomes accurate. You respond to what is actually happening, not to what it symbolizes internally. This accuracy reduces friction. Decisions become cleaner. Boundaries become clearer. Compassion becomes more grounded. The observer also notices how avoidance often hides in plain sight. Productivity can mask discomfort. Positivity can mask grief. Logic can mask fear. Even spiritual language can mask unresolved emotions. Avoidance is clever. It adapts. Observation must be equally subtle. When awareness catches avoidance in real time, something shifts. You notice the urge to distract yourself when a certain feeling arises. You notice the impulse to criticize when vulnerability appears. You notice the story forming to justify turning away. These moments are not failures. They are gateways. Staying with what was previously avoided does not amplify it indefinitely. On the contrary, it allows it to complete. Emotions move when felt. Tensions release when acknowledged. Truths integrate when named internally. What seemed threatening often reveals itself to be manageable. As this inner observation deepens, the outer world responds differently. Interactions soften, conflicts resolve more quickly or never fully form. Opportunities appear that previously went unnoticed, not because reality changed, but because perception is no longer distorted by unexamined avoidance. At this stage, another layer becomes visible. You begin to sense how your internal state subtly influences what you attract and tolerate. Not in a simplistic cause and effect way, but through coherence. When inner signals are aligned, external choices reflect that alignment naturally. This recognition prepares the ground for the next shift. If what you avoid within shapes what you encounter without, then sustained observation must affect more than just understanding. It must influence the quality of your energy, the way you move through situations before words are spoken or actions are taken. And this opens a deeper inquiry into how perception itself alters what unfolds around you. True observation does not stop at understanding. It does not remain confined to insight or self-knowledge. When observation becomes consistent and honest, it changes the quality of your presence. And presence is felt before it is understood. This is what people often describe, imprecisely, as a shift in energy. Energy in this sense is not something mystical or abstract. It is the sum of subtle signals your nervous system is sending at all times. Posture, breathing, facial tension, timing, tone, pace. These signals communicate your internal state long before you speak. When observation reduces internal conflict, those signals reorganize. You become more coherent. In reactive states, energy is scattered. Part of you is anticipating threat. Another part is managing self-image. Another is replaying the past or preparing the future. This fragmentation is felt by others as tension, urgency, or defensiveness, even if your words are polite. True observation brings these fragments back into alignment by removing unnecessary resistance. When you observe thoughts without immediately believing them, mental noise decreases. When you feel emotions without acting them out or suppressing them, emotional charge dissipates. When identification loosens, the body no longer has to defend an image constantly. The result is a quieter system. Quieter does not mean passive, it means available. Availability is felt as groundedness. You are present in the room, in the conversation, in your body. Your attention is not leaking into imagined scenarios. This presence subtly regulates others. People slow down around you. Conversations deepen without effort. Conflict de-escalates more easily, not because you are trying to influence, but because coherence is contagious. This is why true observation cannot be faked. Techniques can be imitated, language can be copied, but energy reveals the truth. If observation is used as a strategy to control outcomes, tension remains. If it is used to avoid feeling, numbness appears. Only observation that includes everything as it is produces coherence. As energy becomes more coherent, choices change. You are less drawn to situations that thrive on chaos, less tolerant of environments that drain attention. Not out of judgment, but out of sensitivity. When you can feel the cost of fragmentation, you naturally move toward what supports clarity. This shift also affects how you are perceived. People may describe you as calm, clear, or steady, without knowing why. Some may feel unsettled, especially those accustomed to reactivity. Coherence exposes incoherence, not by confrontation, but by contrast. This can create distance where relationships were built on shared patterns of avoidance or drama. Internally, the change is subtle but unmistakable. There is less urgency to prove, explain, or defend. Silence becomes comfortable. Waiting feels intelligent rather than anxious. You trust perception more than impulse. This trust reduces the constant need to check, confirm, or correct. Energy also influences what you notice. In a reactive state, attention is pulled toward problems. In a coherent state, attention widens. Possibilities appear where before there were only obstacles. Timing improves. You speak when it matters and remain silent when it doesn't. This is not luck, it is alignment between perception and action. As this alignment stabilizes, patterns that once repeated lose their momentum. Situations that relied on your reactivity no longer gain traction. You are no longer predictable in the old ways. This unpredictability is not chaos. It is freedom from conditioned response. At a deeper level, true observation changes your relationship with effort. You stop pushing against reality and start working with it. This reduces friction and conserves energy. Actions feel cleaner, less draining. Rest becomes restorative rather than escapist. And yet, this is not the end of the process. As energy becomes more coherent, a new responsibility emerges. With greater influence comes greater sensitivity to subtle shifts, both within yourself and in the environment. You begin to sense how small changes in perception can alter entire trajectories. This sensitivity invites a deeper refinement of attention, where observation is no longer just about seeing clearly, but about maintaining coherence in the midst of movement. Become the one who sees before acting, the one who understands before judging, the one who feels the moment fully before speaking into it. While the world rushes forward, pulled by noise and habit, you learn to remain still long enough to perceive what is actually happening. This stillness is not hesitation, it is mastery. When others react, you observe. When others are certain, you stay curious. When emotions rise, you feel them without being driven by them. From this place, your actions carry clarity instead of impulse, and your presence carries weight without force. You are no longer moved by every trigger, nor blinded by the obvious. You begin to see what others overlook, not because you are special, but because you are present. If this resonated with you, write this exact sentence in the comments: I choose to see before I act. And if you want to go deeper into this way of perceiving reality, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If this kind of content speaks to you, there is more waiting for you there.